Hello, everyone. I'm Seth Jarvis. Prior to my retirement in 2019, I was a planetarium director, but these days the science lessons I care about the most involve explaining why electric vehicles are important to our future. But first, a couple of disclaimers. Other than being an EV owner since 2016, I have no personal or financial connections with any company concerned with electric vehicles. Also in this presentation, I use a variety of images taken from the web. I make no claim to ownership for any of these images, and this presentation is intended solely for educational purposes. Okay, now let's get started. I'm talking about electric vehicles because internal combustion engines are responsible for over a fourth of all greenhouse gas emissions and half of all local air pollution. Today, we pay an increasingly high price, both in terms of quality of life and economic impact, for the pollutants our vehicles pump into the air. Since we're going to be talking a lot about energy and making things move, we should start at the beginning. Life requires energy, and for a very long time that meant chasing something down, killing it, and then eating it. The invention of agriculture let us settle down into larger groups and enjoy more complex social systems, but growing food instead of hunting it still took a lot of back-breaking work. But did it always have to be our backs doing the work? Aha, no. We discovered that we could get work done by using energy that was not just our own. This was a huge advancement. Before long, people figured out that you could tap into nature's everyday energy, like water flowing downhill or the wind. But sometimes rivers run dry and sometimes the wind doesn't blow. Eventually, someone figured out that boiling water to make pressurized steam in a device with a cylinder, a piston, and a crankshaft could produce useful amounts of power wherever and whenever you needed it. Just add wheels and you've started an earth-shaking revolution in transportation. It's a revolution that's still going strong to this day. Isaac Newton's first two laws of motion tell us that if you want something to move, you first have to give it a push, and how much it moves depends on its mass and how hard you push it. From this, we get the physical principle that force is equal to mass times acceleration. To standardize a unit of force and to give it a name, it was established that 1 Newton of force was equal to 1 kilogram of mass accelerated at a constant rate of 1 meter per second per second. So far, so good. What then is the difference between force and work? Well, work was defined as force applied over time, and so a unit of work energy, known as a watt, was declared to be 1 Newton applied for 1 second. In America, our favorite unit of measurement for work is called horsepower. The term horsepower originated with measurements of how much weight an average brewery horse could lift in 1 second. Thanks to the observations of Watt and Boulton in 1792, 1 horsepower was declared to be 550 pounds lifted 1 foot in 1 second. 1 horsepower is also equal to 746 watts. While Americans love horsepower, elsewhere in the world it's common to measure an engine's output in kilowatts. We can admire this snazzy little sports car for its impressive 265 horsepower, but others will be impressed by the 200 kilowatts it has under the hood. A major characteristic of engine performance is torque, which describes a twisting force exerted on an axis of rotation. In the metric world, torque is expressed as newtons of force applied at a distance of 1 meter, and the unit of measurement is called Newton meters. In imperial units, torque is measured as pounds of force at a distance of 1 foot, and is known as either pound-feet or foot-pounds. Internal combustion engines produce horsepower and torque at significantly different rates depending on engine speed, with engines having very little horsepower or torque at low engine speeds and achieving maximum output only after the engine is turning at several thousand revolutions per minute. Keeping the engine's power output optimal over a wide range of driving speeds is why internal combustion vehicles require transmissions. But an electric vehicle's motor can produce its full torque from a dead stop, and it generally doesn't begin to diminish until the vehicle is well past freeway speeds. While there may be a simple reduction gear between the electric motor and a drive shaft, there is no transmission. To put an EV into reverse, you just make the motor spin backwards. When driving, you experience horsepower and torque differently. Horsepower generally determines a vehicle's top speed, while torque is that satisfying push you feel against your back while accelerating. The motors used in EV drivetrains tend to have a lot of torque, all of which is available the instant the stoplight turns green, and as a result, there is a lot of grinning associated with driving an EV. Electric vehicles definitely represent a disruptive technology, so we should spend a minute reviewing the speed with which disruptive technologies become normalized. Spoiler alert, disruptive change happens really fast. A good way to visualize how quickly a disruptive technology makes the transition from being rare to being everywhere is the S-curve. Change begins slowly, then there is some kind of inflection point, followed by a rapid acceleration in the rate of adoption until saturation is achieved and the adoption rate slows down because what was once novel has become commonplace. Tony Seba is a futurist who likes to illustrate how quickly disruptive change can happen by using this photo taken in 1900 of New York City's Fifth Avenue. Horses everywhere. And remember, horses were how humans got around for millennia. He then shows a photo of the same street just 13 years later. It's a completely different world. The rate at which we made the transition from horses to internal combustion was simply astonishing. The same S-curve applies to other disruptive technologies. For example, 100 years ago, almost no one had a radio in their home, but just 20 years later, it was rare to find a home without one. News and entertainment could now be delivered to millions of people across the country at the speed of light. Home refrigerators, roughly 20 years from being rare to being universal. Refrigerators profoundly changed how and what we ate, and that revolutionized the food industry. Landline telephones took longer because a significant infrastructure was required, but considering the telephone's huge impact on society, it was nonetheless a rapidly adopted technology. Microwave ovens. Just set the timer for 15 years. Ding! They're everywhere. And once again, revolutionizing how and what we ate. Cellular telephones. In the early 90s, they were rare. 10 years later, they were everywhere. Ask yourself this. How significant a change was it for phone numbers to be associated with people instead of with places? And smartphones. That change came even faster, not even 10 years. Now, think for a moment about the powerful social, political, and economic disruptions occurring around the world today because we're all walking around with internet-connected computers in our pockets. There are other aspects of disruptive change that also need to be kept in mind. Remember the speed with which landline phones were adopted? By the 1970s, they were everywhere, and they remained everywhere until around 2000, and then something interesting happened. At the start of the 21st century, landline phones began disappearing from people's homes. What was going on? Well, because like the fate of horse-drawn carriages once automobiles appeared, people stopped using landline phones when they realized they didn't need them anymore. They had been replaced by something of greater utility. Change is inevitable. So now consider the S-curve of electric vehicles. The inflection point has already been reached, and we are now in the beginning of the rapid adoption phase. News headlines about the skyrocketing demand for EVs are everywhere. In response to the rapidly worsening climate crisis, the European Union has voted to ban the sale of new internal combustion-powered automobiles and light-duty trucks in 2035. And California just announced a similar ban, and on the same schedule. 15 other states have committed to following California's example by 2035. Does that feel like too little time for such a huge change? Not really. Remember, this world-changing disruption took just 13 years, and it was of greater significance. It's worth noting that electric cars are not a novel technology. They've been around for more than a century. In fact, it was an electric car that in 1899 became the first road vehicle to exceed a speed of 100 kilometers per hour. The EVs of 1910 were elegant, smooth, reliable, and easy to operate, very prestigious. In terms of cost, they were about as expensive to buy then as an Audi or a BMW is today. The cleanliness, quiet, and simplicity of electric cars made them popular with affluent city dwellers, and urban businesses appreciated the economics of electric delivery trucks that were less expensive to operate and easier to maintain than a stable full of horses. Then oil took over everything. The gasoline-powered Model T made automobiles affordable to many more people. It had a longer range, and with a top speed of 40 miles per hour, it was faster than any EV available at the time. Electric vehicles faded into the background. Until 1996 and the introduction of the General Motors EV1. The all-electric EV1 was smooth, quiet, fast, comfortable, and reliable. It had good range, was cheap to operate, and it was virtually maintenance-free. GM produced over 1,100 of these, but would only lease them. And although EV1 drivers loved these cars, GM decided, for reasons that remain a little murky to this day, to get out of the EV business. And so, in 1999, GM terminated all EV1 leases, rounded them all up, and sent them to the crusher, despite EV1 drivers begging GM to let them buy out their leases and offering really generous amounts of money for them. GM, nonetheless, refused. 9 years later, the auto industry heard the sound of distant thunder with the arrival of the all-electric Tesla Roadster. Sure, at $100,000, it was easy to dismiss as a plaything for California millionaires, and it wasn't produced in any great quantity. And who the hell was Tesla anyway? I mean, everybody knows you don't make cars in Silicon Valley. But it had great performance, impressive range, and it generated a ton of media attention. Then just 2 years later, the thunder grew louder as Nissan introduced the Leaf. Unlike Tesla, Nissan was a major league automaker. The Leaf was practical, reliable, pure electric, and it was definitely affordable. Its seated four was quiet and plenty zippy. Best of all, it was eco-friendly and extremely inexpensive to operate. All that gave it loads of mass-market appeal. Electric vehicles were no longer misfit distractions that Detroit could ignore. At the start of the 2010s, the public was making it clear that they liked these things and wanted more. There's always someone who feels threatened by change, and so EV critics seized on the concept of range anxiety. Trying their best to sound like a tour guide at a haunted house, they asked, "But what happens when the battery dies?" That's just not a useful question. Let's instead ask a question that can address the real issue. How much range does an EV need? Well, according to the U.S. Department of Transportation, Americans drive an average of about 14,000 miles per year, with a median of 30 miles driven every day. So even a first-generation EV with a range of less than 80 miles is still highly practical for most drivers. Today, it is very rare for a new EV to have a range of less than 200 miles, while EVs with ranges of 300 miles or more are increasingly common. Running out of battery just is not a realistic worry. The next criticism directed at EVs was, "Don't they take forever to charge? I'm in a hurry." Okay, let's talk for a minute about charging speeds. Ask yourself, how long do you spend refilling at a gas station? 5, maybe 10 minutes, 3 or 4 times per month? That means you're spending several hours per year refueling your vehicle, and that does not include the time you spend driving to or from the gas station. Now compare that to charging an EV at home. Step 1. Park the car in your garage and open the charging port. 2. Grab the charging plug. 3. Plug it in and walk away. Total time maybe 10 seconds. The car will start charging when you have it programmed to start, and it will charge up to the percentage level you have set for it to charge. My car is programmed to start each night at 3 a.m., and it adds about 40 miles of range to the battery per hour, so most days my car is charging for less than an hour. Next morning, step 4. Unplug and hang up the cord. Total time maybe 10 or 15 seconds per day. That works out to be a total of maybe 1 or 2 hours per year, instead of spending 6 to 10 hours per year standing next to your car at a gas station. Now let's talk about types of charging. An important fact to remember is that most EV owners charge their cars at home. There are two types of home charging known as level 1 and level 2. Level 1 refers to 120 volts alternating current at 12 amps from a standard household wall outlet. Volts times amps equals watts, so 120 volts at 12 amps equals about 1400 watts or 1.4 kilowatts. That's roughly the same amount of power that a hairdryer uses. Level 1 charging typically adds about 4 miles of range to the battery per hour, so charging your car from, say, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. will add more than 30 miles of range overnight. For a lot of EV owners, Level 1 works just fine. However, Level 2 is by far the most popular type of EV charging, and it connects to a home's 240 volt power. Level 2 typically draws between 7 and 11 kilowatts, which is the equivalent of running a larger home's central air conditioning system. With Level 2 equipment, most EV owners end up charging for maybe an hour each night. I am on a time-of-use rate plan with my electric utility, and that gives me inexpensive electricity during off-peak hours, and that lets me drive my car every day for about 2 cents per mile. That's the equivalent of a gas-powered vehicle that gets more than 200 miles per gallon. Finally, there is DC fast charging. For Teslas, it's called supercharging, but it's the same thing. DC fast charging bypasses the car's onboard AC to DC converter and sends DC power straight into the battery. Most DC fast charging stations send power into your battery at rates of anywhere from 100 kilowatts to 350 kilowatts, which is kind of amazing. DC fast charging is for road trips when you need to add a lot of range in a hurry. With most DC fast chargers, adding 150 or 200 miles of range to your battery takes about the same amount of time you need to hit the restroom, clean the windshield, get a drink, and maybe do some stretches because you've been driving for 2 or 3 hours. DC fast charging on interstate road trips generally works out to be the equivalent fueling cost of a gas-powered vehicle getting 40 miles or so per gallon, and that makes DC fast charging the most expensive electricity you can feed an EV. But when you're on a road trip, fueling up for the equivalent of 40 miles per gallon is still not bad. Now let's spend a minute looking at the types of plugs used by EVs. For all electric vehicles in North America except Tesla, the SAE J1772, sometimes just called a J-plug, is the standard connector and is used for both Level 1 and Level 2 charging. Most home Level 2 charging installations will use a 240 volt wall outlet of the same kind that you would install for an electric clothes dryer. A popular type of 240 volt outlet for use with electric vehicles is the NEMA 1450, and it's rated for up to 50 amps. The wall of a typical EV owner's garage looks something like this. A dedicated 240 volt line runs from the breaker panel to a 240 volt outlet. The black box connected to the 240 volt outlet is called the Electric Vehicle Supply Equipment, or EVSE. Most people call it the charger, but in reality the charging hardware is built into the car. The EVSE simply manages and monitors the AC power going from your 240 volt outlet to the car. You can think of it as a highly intelligent extension cord. The public charging stations you see around today are typically Level 2 EVSEs with J1772 connections, and they'll add range to an EV at a rate of about 30 miles per hour. A growing number of public buildings and businesses are adding Level 2 stations for use by employees and customers. These stations are also popular with EV owners who live in apartment complexes or otherwise can't install their own home charging equipment. Many hotels, motels, restaurants, and resorts now offer free Level 2 chargers on site for use by guests. It's a marketing strategy that attracts and retains customers. For DC fast charging on road trips, there are 3 different types of plugs to know about. This plug type is called CHAdeMO, and it's used almost exclusively by the Nissan Leaf for DC fast charging. CHAdeMO is typically limited to a maximum of 50 kilowatts, which these days is considered pretty slow, and I think it explains why CHAdeMO is quickly becoming obsolete. Unless you're taking a long road trip in a Nissan Leaf, you can ignore CHAdeMO. Rapidly becoming the de facto standard for DC fast charging is the Combined Charging System, often referred to as CCS and sometimes just called the combination plug. The top half of the CCS port accepts the J1772 connector, And when you need to DC fast charge, you uncover the DC connections below the J1772 and then use the CCS plug. Then there's Tesla. The same plug is used for level 1, level 2, and DC fast charging. It's compact, simple, and sturdy. Tesla superchargers are the most abundant, most strategically distributed, and are by far the most reliable DC fast charging network in the world. Do not get me started about why it has not been adopted as the EV charging standard. Let's just move on. So, which connector is best? Honestly, today it really doesn't matter. Adapters now allow non-Teslas to connect with Tesla Level 2 stations, and they will soon support DC fast charging at Tesla superchargers. Conversely, other adapters allow Teslas to connect to both J1772 and CCS fast charging stations. Bottom line, everything is compatible with everything. To maximize your battery's life, try to avoid operating it at extreme states of charge. A good rule of thumb for daily driving is to not charge the battery above about 85% or drive it down below about 15%. Occasionally operating outside of this rule is okay, just don't make a habit of it. Start your day with the battery at 80-ish%, drive whatever miles you need to drive, and then at the end of the day, whether you've driven 15 miles or 150, you plug in and charge at night, every night. For EV owners, the happy battery rule is ABC, always be charging. On road trips, it's okay to drain lower and charge higher. That said, my bladder has a shorter range than my battery, so I tend to stop for a quick recharge every couple of hours. Also, EV batteries charge fastest between 10% and 60%, so it's actually a lot more time efficient on a road trip to stop and charge more frequently, but only up to 60%, than it is to charge less frequently and charge up to 90%. Again, if you need to charge to 90%, that's okay, just try not to do it all the time, and you should only charge above 90% if there's something really unusual about your route and you know you're going to need every last kilowatt hour. As the nationwide build-out of DC fast charging infrastructure continues to accelerate, the need to ever worry about your battery's last mile of range will quickly disappear. Next, from the critics, scary stories about the battery's longevity. I read this a lot on social media. The claim is that the battery in an EV is just a big version of the battery in your phone. It's good for only a couple of years, and then it has to be replaced for $1 billion. The origin of this criticism was the unfortunate reputation of early models of the Nissan Leaf. The Leaf uses what is called passive battery thermal management, which just means it's air-cooled. And that turns out to be inadequate for maintaining the health of small EV batteries under frequent heavy use. EVs that are not Nissan Leafs use what is known as active battery thermal management, and these batteries are proving to have impressive longevities. It's now normal to see a few percent loss in capacity over a vehicle's first couple of years, and that then tapers to an extremely low rate of degradation thereafter. EV batteries manufactured in the past 5 or 6 years look like they'll retain close to 90% of their original capacity out to 200,000 miles. The latest advances in battery chemistries promise even better longevity in the future. Also, the cost of EV batteries is falling rapidly. By the time you have to start thinking about replacing your EV battery, it will cost no more than replacing a worn-out internal combustion engine, and the battery chemistry will be even better. The pandemic and supply chain disruptions have recently put a bump on this trend, but the long-term forecast is nonetheless for the price of EV batteries to continue falling. And why am I not describing to you all the impressive advances in EV battery tech that are being made? Seriously, the rate of progress now being made in the universe of EV battery design, chemistry, manufacturing, and recycling is breathtaking. Breakthroughs in EV battery tech seem to be announced monthly. So why am I skipping it? Because it is all dark magic. If I had an hour to devote solely to what's happening with EV batteries, it wouldn't be enough to scratch the surface, and I would be lying to you if I claimed to understand it well enough to explain it. What I can say with confidence is that EV batteries are rapidly becoming more powerful, safer, longer lasting, less dependent on rare metals, and more recyclable and cheaper to manufacture every year. EV critics have recently seized on the idea that when a blizzard shuts down the highway, like what happened to Virginia's I-95 in January 2022, and hundreds of travelers were stuck in their cars for more than a day, EV owners would be left to freeze to death while everyone else stays cozy warm in their gas-powered cars. The reality is quite different. Car and Driver magazine studied this question and found that while there was a lot of variability in how much energy different types of vehicles use per hour to keep their cabins warm, when you make an apples-to-apples comparison, they found that you'd be no worse off being snowbound for a day in an EV than you would be in a gas-powered car, and there is no danger of you accidentally asphyxiating on your exhaust fumes. But speaking of cold, remember your high school science? Chemical reactions slow down as temperature drops, and batteries are chemical devices. On a 15-minute run to the store in freezing weather and with no battery preconditioning, an EV will report a drop in range of as much as a third. But that's only on short trips. If, however, you use your phone to connect to your freezing cold EV and give it a 15 or 20-minute heads up before you depart, or if you're driving for more than an hour, the battery management system will use a little of the battery's power to warm itself and minimize range loss. I've personally found that on interstate road trips in freezing temperatures, my range drops by about 15%. And by the way, your gas-powered car's efficiency drops dramatically in cold conditions too. Cold air is more dense and therefore requires more energy to push through, and cold tires have more rolling resistance. It's all just physics. One of the most lurid criticisms thrown at EVs is the claim that EVs are death traps, just waiting to incinerate their owners. We've all seen the videos, but the reality is that while flaming Teslas can easily capture a TV news producer's attention, flaming Toyotas usually don't. So guess which kind of vehicle fire is actually the most common? It's hard to get a comprehensive picture for the rates of vehicle fires in all the different makes of EVs, but for Teslas, the data are crystal clear. On a basis of vehicle fires reported per million miles driven, a Tesla is 11 times less likely to experience a fire than a gas-powered vehicle. Who could have guessed that proximity to gasoline correlates strongly with fire? To understand why EVs are so cheap to operate, let's start by comparing the energy efficiency of electric motors to the efficiency of internal combustion engines. Let's start with the energy equivalent of a gallon of gasoline. It's 36.6 kilowatt hours. So the gasoline equivalent of a 75 kilowatt hour battery in an electric vehicle is about 2 gallons. Yet the range of that 75 kilowatt hour battery in an electric vehicle is 250 to 300 miles. So 250 to 300 miles on the energy equivalent of 2 gallons of gas. How is that possible? Well, it's because electric vehicle drivetrains are more than 90% efficient, while internal combustion engines struggle to achieve 30% efficiency. Another important way EVs are more efficient is in the way they decelerate. In an internal combustion vehicle, the brakes convert momentum into heat energy through friction, and that heat then simply radiates away into space. It's lost. But in a modern EV, lifting your foot off the accelerator causes the motors to behave like generators, converting the vehicle's momentum into electrical energy, which recharges the battery and reclaims as much as 80% of the energy that went into acceleration. It may take a day or two to get used to it, but with regen braking, you quickly learn to be a one-pedal driver and you rarely touch your brakes. And you can guess what that means for how long an EV will go between brake jobs. And speaking of maintenance, the more complex a machine is, the more maintenance it requires. Few things in our lives are as complicated as the drivetrains of internal combustion-powered vehicles. Inside these machines, a huge number of precision-made parts, each capable of breaking down and wearing out, thrash around in conditions of extreme heat, converting dozens of violent chemical explosions each second into mostly smooth mechanical motion. Yet, even after more than a century of brilliant engineering, internal combustion is still far, far better at turning gasoline into heat, pollution, and noise than it is into mechanical motion. Fortunately, a new way of thinking about how we make vehicles move has arrived, and it's exciting stuff. Today's electric vehicle drivetrains have very few moving parts. An EV motor has one moving part. Significantly, that one moving part, called the rotor, does exactly what its name implies. It just rotates smoothly, powerfully, and quietly within computer-controlled magnetic fields. That translates into very high energy efficiency and very little maintenance. How little maintenance? Well, here are just a partial list of the maintenance items associated with an internal combustion vehicle that are not found in an EV. All of these represent unavoidable maintenance expenses for the owner. Not only is an EV's basic energy efficiency significantly greater, comparing the fueling cost per mile between electricity and gasoline is equally eye-opening. Let's step through this. The average car in America gets about 27 miles per gallon. At $4.20 per gallon, that works out to be about 16 cents per mile. Even in a 50 mile per gallon Toyota Prius, that's still 9 cents per mile. Now, 1 kilowatt hour of battery will take an electric vehicle 3.5 to 4 miles, and that 1 kilowatt hour at off-peak rates is going to cost about a nickel, which works out to be 2 cents per mile. Even if you're not on a special rate plan and you're paying normal rates of 11 cents per kilowatt hour, that's still only 4 cents per mile. A simple physical reality is that molecules will always be more expensive to produce and distribute than electrons, and so it is extremely unlikely that petroleum as a fuel will ever be economically competitive with electricity. I'm losing track of all the studies that have concluded that owning an EV is more economical than an internal combustion-powered vehicle. Here's just one example. In 2020, Consumer Reports concluded that the combination of lower fueling and maintenance costs and a better resale value made the total 5-year cost of owning an EV significantly less expensive than owning a comparable gas-powered vehicle, even though the gas-powered vehicle had a much lower initial purchase price. The City of New York owns thousands of vehicles, and they track each vehicle's operating and maintenance expenses closely. Their data are conclusive. The most frugal use of public funds is to electrify the fleet. There is an encouraging phenomenon sweeping the country. Municipal governments are switching to EVs because they have great performance, high reliability, and cost a lot less to operate and maintain than gas-powered vehicles. In fact, if you are a public official today tasked with ensuring the responsible use of taxpayer dollars, then you are being irresponsible by not electrifying your fleet of vehicles. Westport, Connecticut found that the initial price difference between an EV and a gas-powered police cruiser was recovered through lower operating and maintenance costs in just its first year. Also a big plus for city officials, each electric police vehicle reduces the city's carbon footprint by more than 23 tons of CO2. And I'm sure you'll be surprised to learn that the police ride-along program in Westport is now very popular. Here's another fascinating disruptive change. In the U.S., 500,000 school buses sit idle for 14 or more hours per day. That's just the nature of school buses. Electrifying school buses not only saves school districts a huge amount in fuel and maintenance costs, the districts can then sell their buses' unused battery power back to the electric utility for a profit during peak demand periods. The buses then recharge in the middle of the night at low off-peak rates. This pilot program in Massachusetts found that electric school buses became moneymakers for the school district while also stabilizing the power grid during times of peak demand. The significance of electric vehicles in the fight against climate change cannot be overstated. Well-to-wheels comparisons that examine the total greenhouse gas emissions associated with fuel production, processing, distribution, and consumption per mile driven have found that EVs have by far the lowest greenhouse gas emissions of any automobile fuel type. And that's with today's mix of fossil fuels used in generating electricity. Even when the extra energy that goes into manufacturing their batteries is taken into consideration, EVs still have a significantly smaller contribution to climate change than internal combustion vehicles. Nationally, the average gas-powered vehicle would need to get 93 miles per gallon to reduce its greenhouse emissions to the equivalent of an average electric vehicle. Variations in this figure are mainly a function of each regional electric grid's dependency on coal, and the amount of coal used in generating electricity is declining rapidly. As the grid gets cleaner, your EV gets greener. Speaking of the grid, EV critics have seized on news coverage of how recent summer heat waves stressed California's power grid, and now they're promoting a new scary story, claiming that the electric grid can't handle the rapidly growing popularity of EVs. The facts are that climate change is increasing the frequency and severity of heat waves, and reducing the use of fossil fuels is imperative to addressing climate change, and the electrification of transportation is indeed happening fast. So we do need to spend a minute talking about the concept of peak demand and the electric grid. The widespread adoption of air conditioning in the 1960s and 70s represented a bigger challenge to the power grid than EVs, and it was the boom in air conditioning that pretty much created the concept of summertime peak demand, when temperatures are highest and people are home from school and work and they're preparing meals and watching TV in air-conditioned comfort. Note that the time of day when extra power consumption should be avoided is only a fraction of the day, from mid-afternoon to early evening, and that's Monday through Friday. Unlike air conditioning, however, EVs don't need to draw power during the hottest parts of the weekday. Charging during off-peak hours is now how most EV owners keep their batteries charged. Middle-of-the-night charging is just more convenient. Beyond convenience, electric utility time-of-use rate plans now offer powerful economic incentives for EV drivers to charge during off-peak hours and not to charge during peak hours. Where I live, the time-of-use rate plan I'm on makes the price of electricity during off-peak hours 1/5 as expensive as it is during peak hours. Ask yourself this: how much gas or diesel would you buy between 3 p.m. and 8 p.m. Monday through Friday if during those hours it cost $9 per gallon, but at all other times and on weekends it cost $1.80 a gallon? That's what it's like to be on a time-of-use rate plan with an EV. Simply by being mindful about timing when EVs charge, the existing power grid right now could handle half of all U.S. vehicles becoming EVs, and by the time when most vehicles on the road are electric, around the year 2050, the grid will have completed a variety of significant improvements in efficiency, capacity, and carbon neutrality that are now underway. Stop. Hold on a second. Who am I kidding? The criticism directed at EVs that is actually true and demands to be honestly faced is the fact that right now electric vehicles are expensive. And as long as the demand for them is greater than the supply, that's not going to change anytime soon. We have to talk about affordability. There are now a variety of really impressive EVs on the market, but by the time you get one in your driveway, you'll probably have spent close to $50,000. Even the most affordable new EV you can buy in the US today, the excellent Chevy Bolt, will still set you back around $30,000 by the time you've registered it. A $7,500 federal tax credit for new models in 2023 certainly helps a lot, but for the transition to EVs to succeed, there must be a lower cost option for people who either can't or don't want to spend that kind of money. Fortunately, as EV demand skyrockets, there are used car dealerships popping up that specialize in what they like to call previously owned EVs. If you shop around with these dealerships, you can find a good used EV for less than $15,000. And in 2023, a used EV will qualify for up to $4,000 in federal tax credits. Sure, some of these EVs have a range of less than 100 miles, but remember, that's going to be plenty of range for your daily driving because you'll be charging every night at work or on campus. And as the charging infrastructure rapidly expands, you'll probably have little difficulty finding a place to charge no matter where you go. But maybe even a more important question that we should be asking is, does your next EV even need to be a car? The answer is no. The fastest growing electrified transportation market these days is e-bikes. For $1,000 or $2,000, you can own an e-bike that will carry you and your groceries dozens of sweat-free miles every day at speeds of 20 to 25 miles per hour. Charging is easy and ultra cheap using any wall outlet, and next thing you know, you've dramatically reduced your need for internal combustion in order to get around. Folks, let's keep our eyes on the prize here. A significant reduction in our use of fossil fuels is the goal we must all achieve. It doesn't matter if we reach for it in a new EV or a used one or with 4 wheels or with 2. What matters is that we get it. And with that, we're done. Thank you for your time.